Today, as I set out on my morning stroll around town with my dog Maisie, I noticed pranksters had paid one of my neighbors an overnight visit. Ribbons of toilet paper festooned the trees and shrubs surrounding the historic Victorian and rippled in the morning breeze. That took me straight back to high school when scarcely a weekend went by without at least one house suffering the same fate. In my hometown, the practice was, and I assume still is, called rolling. In the wider world, I've more often heard it called TPing. If the victim was a student, the attack was seen as a sign of popularity. After all, who'd waste that much effort on a geek, a nerd, or a dweeb? If the victim was a teacher, they usually took it in good humor, but that was before the victim was Evil Ivy, the geometry teacher. Ivy ruled her classes with an iron hand. She worked in intimidation and sarcasm like Michelangelo worked in marble. Those foolish enough to raise her ire soon regretted it. Tall and angular, she prowled the classroom like a praying mantis, always on the lookout for distracted students. If she found one, they were reduced to a pool of dread in short order. To be fair, she usually focused on the most gifted, pushing them toward higher and higher achievements. Slubs like me, she mostly ignored. Ivy and her husband had just recently built a home in the brand new upscale suburb of West Hills, where the town's upper crust had recently begun migrating, abandoning their large, drafty, historic homes on the town's streets and boulevards for modern split levels and ranch houses outside town. Ivy had invested quite a bit in professional landscaping with an eye to the future. The large, freshly seeded lawn was carefully curated with infant shrubs and trees and flower beds in profusion. When word got around the school one Monday morning the Midnight Raiders had paid Ivy a visit over the weekend, there was universal dismay. Anyone could have been so foolish. Worse still were reports that carefully planted trees and shrubs had been crushed or uprooted and the pristine flower beds trodden into the mud. We were all seated in Ivy's classroom when the bell rang, which was unusual in itself. She was usually seated at her desk watching the clock as we straggled in. Suddenly, she was there at the door. She carefully closed it behind her, and if she'd locked it and swallowed the key, it would not have been out of character. We all became very interested in our desktops. "I believe some of you paid me a visit recently," she said evenly. Then she began walking up and down the rows of desks, stopping occasionally next to one student or another. "You were there," she would announce. "So were you," and so on until she had identified each perpetrator in the room. This excruciating ceremony was repeated in her other sections until all the guilty had been identified. It was widely assumed she'd used her extraordinary powers of deduction to identify the perpetrators, but I wonder if she hadn't just snagged one of the ringleaders and interrogated them before class. "I've calculated the damages," she said, "and divided it accordingly." She wrote a figure on the board. "Those who do not pay by the end of the week will suffer the consequences." To my knowledge, there were no holdouts. Somehow I managed to go most of the year without catching her attention, but that was about to change. My buddy Bill and I were pretty much constant companions at the time. He sat directly in front of me in Ivy's class, and it was a good spot. He was taller than me and much better at math. Whenever Ivy asked a question, his hand was always the first one up, and I was effectively hidden from her sightlines most of the time. Every Saturday, the local theater had for years featured an all-day lineup of the low-budget science fiction films both Bill and I loved, and we were there almost every week. But of late, they'd started showing the beach movies of Frankie and Annette on Saturday nights. The films themselves were awful, but they featured bevies of pulchritudinous young ladies in bikinis jiggling and gyrating with abandon, so we immediately changed our attendance habits accordingly. We weren't alone. We were joined by virtually the entire high school, both male and female. One of the films featured a biker character named Eric Von Zipper. If someone touched his temple, he would freeze like a statue. Based on this concept, many of the male students developed a sort of Squid Game in which we hunted each other through the halls at passing time. By simply clicking a pin in the victim's direction, accompanied by shouting beep, the hunter could freeze his prey in place. They had to stay frozen until a friend unfroze them by clicking the pin twice and saying beep beep, or the warning bell rang, whichever came first. We were all seated in Ivy's geometry class, and I was ticked at Bill for leaving me frozen the whole passing time, so I reached around with my pen, clicked it, and whispered beep. I had totally forgotten this ill-considered action when about halfway through the class, Ivy called on him. "Can you give us the answer, Mr. Hilton?" Not his real name. He didn't respond. "Mr. Hilton?" Still no answer. I was frantic by this time. I could not believe he hadn't broken. She was on her feet now and coming toward us. She stopped next to Bill's desk. "Do we have a problem?" she asked. The whole class looked as if they were seeing a particularly awful traffic accident unfold in slow motion before their eyes. There was nothing left to do. Pale as a sheet, with trembling hand, knowing my life was over, I reached around, clicked my pen twice, and squeaked out, "Beep, beep." Bill immediately came to life, gave Ivy the correct answer to her question, and sat waiting. "Why didn't you answer me the first time?" she asked. Calmly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, Bill answered, "He beeped me." Ivy received this information without emotion. She looked from Bill to me and from me to Bill. Then, without moving or turning her head, she called out another student's name. "Mr. Lindsay." There was an audible gasp and a thunk as Sheldon Lindsay started so hard he knocked his book to the floor. "Go to the board," Ivy said, and Sheldon scrambled to obey. I never knew why she chose to let us live, but I think I saw a tiny smile wrinkling the corners of her mouth as she turned away.